All right. Well, thank you guys for having all of us here. We're excited about this discussion. I wanted to start, as we think about polling, with an anecdote from 2010. I was at the Boston Globe at the time, and there was a hot special election. Scott Brown, a state senator from Wrentham, Massachusetts, was the Republican nominee running against Martha Coakley, the Attorney General, in a seat that Ted Kennedy had held for 47 years. So the assumption was it was a Democratic race to lose. So at the Globe, we did a poll. We commissioned a poll about 2 weeks out from the race, and we were in the field until Thursday before our Sunday paper. And so on Friday, we got the results, and it kind of confirmed what we all had sort of intuited about the race, which was that Martha Coakley was up significantly. And so the Sunday paper, we had a banner headline, Senate poll, Coakley up 15. And so 10 days later, we had a different banner headline, which is that Brown defeats Coakley. And he won by 5 points, or nearly 5 points. And so to me, I always think about that poll as a reminder that polling is a snapshot of a given, at a given moment of a campaign. It's not often necessarily predictive. And so we had time, and those 10 days in a very fluid race changed a lot. And so I always think about that when I'm thinking about polling, that it's a snapshot. But as we were backstage, Brenda actually has a different role in that race, having been on the Republican side. So I wonder if you had any sort of thoughts on how you guys were looking at that race at that time.
This is pure karma. We didn't plan this, but we were also watching that race as a special election. So he's right. Republicans had no business winning that race. It's Massachusetts. Ted Kennedy owned that seat for almost 50 years. But it was a special election, and special elections are special, right? So we thought, we are going to put money into this race, and we're just going to watch it. And we started tracking the race. And it's hysterical that he said the Globe came out 10 days before the race. About 14 days before election day, we saw the numbers start to move. And we saw Scott Brown starting to gain on Coakley. And seeing stories like the ones published in the Globe, our strategy was like, lock everybody in this building. We are not telling anybody about this polling. We are not letting any of this leak out. We think he's got it. And he just continued to ride that good trajectory up. So we did see it. He just had bad timing. Like he just said, polls are a snapshot in time. His poll was probably correct for when he was in the field, but they missed that wave. And I think somebody else was working that race too.
Well, I was at Celinda Lake's firm, who's a Democratic pollster. I was working for her at the time, and I remember that too, because whoever was hiring her, and I forget whether it was a candidate or DCCC or whatever, but they stopped funding her polling, because she was like, oh, she's ahead 15 points. We don't need to do any more polling. So after the election, after Coakley lost, she got slammed in the press, but she wasn't in the field. She wasn't polling in the field. So yeah, that was a pretty, it's a great example. And I think that race was particularly significant because at the time, Obamacare actually hinged, and many people thought hinged on that race. So there was a lot of post-election conversation about that.
To sort of start the discussion, I think about polls being addictive for political junkies and for people who follow them, and horse race polling in particular. We all kind of follow it very closely, almost in an addictive way in which we know we shouldn't be following it as closely as we do. So I wonder if we could start out just talking a little bit about how we should be using polling and the downsides, I guess, of using horse race polling as a guide. So I don't know if you, maybe Tom, if you have any thoughts on just sort of how political reporters should look at polling and where the useful aspects of them are and where the dangers are.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's tricky because, to your point, we are all, not just reporters, all of us are addicted to the horse race polling, but it's really, from a campaign's perspective, perhaps one of the least important questions that we're asking. From a campaign perspective, we're focused on our ability to change the electorate. That's what it's about, driving resources, not necessarily about predicting outcomes. And so I think that's one important contextual item to keep in mind from a reporter's perspective is to think about what else was included in that. I mean, there are a whole bunch of different elements that I'm sure we'll get into as we talk about polling in general and being better consumers of it. It's, knowing more about the sample. It's knowing more about how the question was asked. What was the actual wording? What was the order of it? Was there a push before it? Are you getting an honest read of the electorate? You alluded to the sample. Is this a likely voter sample or a registered voter sample? There are so many different elements. And in the end, I think the best thing we can do when we approach these polls and these horse race numbers is just take them with a healthy dose of skepticism, as I think is the default probably for everyone in the room, is to ask more questions about them.
And when you're tempted to just cover the horse race, don't. Just don't.
Yeah, I think just keeping it real here, I think our industry as a polling industry does a lot of damage actually to the health of democracy. I think both of our industries do, and I think our relationship together is actually pretty toxic, especially around horse race polling and coverage, and I think you should ignore all horse race polling. I don't think you should ever cover, I mean, if you think about your readers and listeners and, the ordinary American, why is it important for them to know this week to the next? It is not important, especially given the state of polling. I mean, if the race is, I would say maybe if the only thing I can think of is why would a sort of a horse race poll be helpful to Americans is maybe if they see like, oh, there's a 10, 15 point difference. Oh, my candidate, boy, I want to do something to help my candidate. Maybe that's healthy for democracy, but like this obsession is incredibly unhealthy. And I think the coverage of elections through a political game lens, who's winning, who's losing, by how far, strategy, what's his tactics, what are they doing now? It's really, I hear from voters all the time, they're like desperate to they absolutely hate politics. They hate the coverage, and they're desperate for coverage that actually relates to their own lives. So that's my 2 cents.
Can I add 2 more cents real quick? Because I couldn't agree more. And I think, first of all, I'm not qualified at all to tell any of you how to do your job. I'll start with that caveat. I think one thing that we see with the application of horse race polling is to the extent that can drive a narrative. We want to know who's up, who's down, who's going up, who's going down. And the sense of movement that we get from looking at different polls from different pollsters taken at different times. And there are so many examples from last year. An example that sticks with me is the Wisconsin Senate race with Mandela Barnes. He came out of the primary in August. He had a pretty big lead in the polls. And then the polls showed, as we got past Labor Day, that his lead was getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and then he was losing by a little, and then he was losing by a lot. And when you look at what was being reported in Wisconsin, it was trying to tell the story of why Mandela Barnes was blowing it effectively and talking about, well, here's the theory. It was about crime, and it was about the economy and inflation. And in the end, he lost that race by 25,000 votes. The polls had him losing by, I think, an average of 4 or 5 points. I think if we hadn't paid attention to your point, Tresa, to the horse race polling, or at least viewed it in context and with a grain of salt, I think what was being reported on and what voters were hearing about in Wisconsin likely would have been different.
But that doesn't mean the polls are useless. I mean, I was kind of joking. Yes, look at the horse race. It's interesting. It's crack cocaine even for candidates. But there's other things in the polls that are important, I think, even for you as journalists, not just for us as campaigns. Like, look at the issues. Like that Wisconsin is a great example. We worked that race. There was an opera book this thick on Mandela Barnes. Republicans were just drooling. There was Victoria's Secret, lingerie parties, all kinds of stuff. But we used the polling to say, what issues do voters care about in Wisconsin? It was crime, crime, and crime. Not that crime was like going up exponentially in Wisconsin, but they were seeing more homeless camps, just whatever. But we went back to that Oppo book, and minus all that juicy material, it told us we need to focus this race on crime. So look at polls to kind of be instructive of the broader environment. What do voters care about? Who's moving around? You know, another great example in 2020 when we started to see the movement with Hispanic men. That was a great thing that came out of polling. It started in Arizona. It wasn't really where's McSally and where's Mark Kelly. It was, okay, who's shifting around in this race? So I think that is a really good application of polls for you guys as journalists. As far as the horse race, I mean, go out and talk to voters. I think that's the best advice I could give.
Tom, you had done an interview with New York Magazine a few months ago, sort of reflecting a little bit on the midterms, and you said there are lessons that can be learned and applied here, and the biggest lesson is not lending credibility to low-quality partisan polls that lack transparency. I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about that, maybe as a warning sign for folks who see polls, you know, that are partisan or that maybe are not transparent. What are the things that we should be looking for as journalists to figure out which polls are reliable?
Yeah, you know, in the end, I mean, I don't think I'm breaking news here in saying that there are a lot of bad polls last cycle. I think there were, in terms of the ratio of those sort of higher quality polls that have transparency in methodology and sample, in the questionnaire, versus those where we've actually never heard of this firm before. You know, some, and I don't want to, well, I'm going to, there were some high school project polls that were out there, 2 different high schools, one from my hometown of Andover, Massachusetts. And you know, there's been this saying that when polls would come out and it would look kind of weird, people would say, you know, some version of throw it into averages or trust the average. And the idea was, let's not focus on individual poll versus individual poll. Let's look at the macro. Let's throw them all together in average, 538, Real Clear Politics, whatever. And that actually served us pretty well up until last year. But suddenly, because you had this flood of low quality polls, and then at the same time, many media outlets removing their budgets for high quality polls, you couldn't trust the averages anymore. And so, especially in states that were more on the bubble, Washington State is a great example of that, in that Senate race, that's one that came in late where people said, oh gosh, Democratic senator could lose there. And because there were if you look, go back to 538, look at the average there, trust the average. The last month of surveys that were including that average were all from Republican polling firms, mostly from firms who did not have a reputation or a track record. In the end, I think she won by 13, 14 points. You know, New Hampshire Senate race was another one. So, you know, don't necessarily trust the average. Look at who sponsored the poll. Look at the methodology. Is there transparency? I'm sure we'll get into some other elements in terms of other things you can look at. But I think that's the one thing that changed is you can't just trust the averages anymore.
And is it sort of sample size? Is it, you know, like what are like 3 rules of thumb for, like, I have the benefit of the Washington Post that we have a polling team, so I can say like, hey, I just saw this YouGov thing. Does this meet standards? And they'll say yes or no. But like, I think for folks that don't have a polling team to bounce those things off of, are there 3 or 4 like ways that you can sort of tell like, yeah, this is a pretty good poll, other than reputation? I mean, some of it is reputation.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give a real quick real world example. Pennsylvania Senate race. We all know the dynamic of that race where John Fetterman had just a very stubborn, steady lead. There was the debate. And the Oz campaign needed that to be a dynamic changer. And so within a day or 2 of the debate, a poll came out showing Oz winning for the first time. It was a poll that was conducted over one night. So first thing to look at when they were calling, how long they were calling. Is this a one-night thing? If you're calling in one night, you're introducing bias because you're getting only the kind of people who happen to be home answering their phones on a Wednesday night between 6 and 8 p.m. or whatever. The other problems there was, and I don't remember the firm, but in terms of looking at the track record, there wasn't a long track record from that firm. There wasn't transparency about the survey instrument and what other questions they asked. So those are the things that you want to look at. Sample size, when they're calling, and the methodology. Is there a mixed methodology, or is it just, the other thing, they actually had a little transparency there where they showed the sample, and when you looked at the actual sample of voters under the age of 30, it was literally half. They had weighted them down to half of what they had been in any previous election, meaning they had basically erased young people from the electorate. I looked at that poll and said, well, gosh, if Fetterman's only down 2 and young people are at historically low turnout that they'll never reach, I feel good about it. We're going to win. So those are certainly some things that you can look at.
I would echo that. Google them. What is their reputation? Demographics are key. If they don't release the demographics, they're hiding something. So that same poll, I think it had a Republican advantage in Pennsylvania. That's not right. So look at the demographics, and the field time is also key. Yes, YouGov is notorious for the 1-2 day poll, 10,000 interviews. It's crappy data, but also look at the other side. You have a lot of universities that'll field over 3 weeks and release that. I mean, if we're in a campaign, look at probably Dianne Feinstein's numbers. 3 weeks ago, they were probably very different than where they are today. So it's meaningless. So that's absolutely right.
There's a famous example of the Literary Digest that did polling and had like a pretty good track record up until 1936 when they had surveyed their readers, and I think it was a huge sample size, like 1 million postcards or something, to predict that Alfred Landon was going to defeat Franklin Roosevelt, and then Roosevelt won in a landslide. And I think the polling industry seemed to recognize that the sample size of Literary Digest readers are not necessarily representative of the country as a whole. And so, I mean, I wonder if there's a modern day example, I mean, where polling has evolved to, from landlines to cell phones, text messages. There's all kinds of ways to poll. And I wonder if there's anything on the vanguard or sort of how you guys think of polling and how to get a representative sample.
I think one thing to keep in mind for these pre-election polls that are, horse race, who's going to win, or if the election were held today, pollsters who are very smart, actually lots of brilliant people doing this, they're surveying a population that doesn't exist. Who's going to vote in the election, okay? So they have to figure out, they're going to figure out who are they going to include in their poll, how are they going to weight it by what demographics? What are those decisions based on? They're educated guesses, very good educated guesses, often based on previous elections. The issue is new things happen. In 2016, education was, prior to 2016, education wasn't a huge predictor of who people were going to vote for. So a lot of polls leading up to 2016 didn't weight by education. Turns out, a lot of non-educated people with less education voted for Trump. That's one of the reasons the polls were skewed. Another reason, there are a lot of people remain undecided up until, a few days before the election. Typically that breaks, those undecided people break both ways prior to 2016. In 2016, they all broke for Trump. That made polls wrong. So there's a lot of thinking, and you all probably know more about, can speak more to sort of what goes into that. But just remember when you're reading these polls, it's among a sample, and it's polling a population that does not exist yet. And so keep that in your mind.
Yeah, we spend a lot of time thinking about who's going to show up. Obviously, if you're not going to vote, I don't care who you're interested in. So we look at the number one thing that predicts if you're going to vote is if you voted in the past. Most of you already know this. For those of you that don't, it's kind of creepy. But when I pull the voter file, I can see if you voted before. I can't tell how you voted, but I can tell if you showed up, if you participated, either through absentee or in person. And so that is the number one thing we use to model. But then we survey people, particularly new registrants. How excited are you about the election? How much attention are you paying? And we filter in certain percentages of people that have never showed up in the past to sort of build those models. So she's right, it is guessing, but it's an educated guess, and it's probably the most important thing we do as pollsters. I think I could write the most brilliant questionnaire, and it's worthless if I'm surveying the wrong people. So we spend a lot of time thinking about that. But I think that the rest of her answer was really important, and that was, then go check our work. Look at those demographics. If you're looking at a poll from Pennsylvania and it's 5 points Republican, that's not an accurate reflection of the vote, or it has nobody under 35 in it. That's just lazy polling. So I think those are the keys.
Brenda, I want to ask you too. You've worked for a lot of different candidates over the years. George W. Bush, Mitch McConnell, and you mentioned the NRSC. Can you talk a little bit about how? We're always trying to figure this out from the outside. Is how the campaigns are thinking about polling. One tip is to not take any internal polling that a campaign may give you, because they're giving it to you for a reason that's usually not so reliable. But
Raise money.
But I wonder, if inside campaigns there's a feeling of over-reliance on horse race polls, the way that outside we're having this sort of reckoning with our reliance on it, or sort of how campaigns typically will use the internal polling to shape a message, or to, how does that look from the inside?
That is a great question. I'd love to tell you how we use data versus how you guys use data. First, I just feel incredibly outed in a room full of journalists. You all know I work for Senator McConnell. Before I needed police escort to my car, I also worked for Liz Cheney. I'm guessing you guys like her a little bit more, so don't get violent. But yes, so the way that we use polling internally on the campaigns is obviously very different than how you'd use it. We use it for strategic reasons. So I pointed out, we're looking for demographic shifts. Who's moving? Like the biggest example of that is definitely Hispanic men in 2020, when we really started to see those shifts coming. We also look at it to see what's going on in the electorate. So in 2020, in the summer of the protests and taking down statues, we really saw crime rise, and that's why that really became the crime election. I think Democrats were furious. I even sat on a panel with the chair of the DCCC, and she's like, we weren't talking about crime. It's like, it didn't matter because we were, and we knew that's where the voters were. So we look at it for some of that more strategic direction. A couple examples, since I'm outed. So in Leader McConnell's 2020 re-election, he ran against a candidate named Amy McGrath. And we really wanted to run against Amy McGrath. And she had a bit of a primary. McConnell didn't have much of one. So we were already up airing ads against her through her primary. You're really starting to set the stage for the general. We figured, hey, we're in the field anyhow. Let's ask Democrats who they're voting for. And she had this challenger. You might remember him. He ran again against Rand Paul in 2022, named Charles Booker. It was definitely his time. He was a community activist and organizer. It was during the Black Lives Matter movement in Louisville. He was really having a moment, and we saw him rise in the polls, and if that guy would have had 2 more weeks, he would have beat McGrath. So strategically as a campaign, we wanted McGrath. We were like, holy crap. We took down all our anti-McGrath ads. We just put up Sonny McConnell ads. So it was very strategic in how we could kind of get the candidate we wanted. Another good example, some of you aren't old enough to remember this probably, but actually it was that 2020 cycle too. Joni Ernst, senator from Iowa. As a campaign, the most valuable resource we have, the most important thing we have is our candidate's time. Where are we going to put her? Where is she going to go? Where are we going to, she only has so many hours in the day, especially because she was an incumbent, so she had to be in DC for votes. So we look at the polls, and all of a sudden you see there's a problem in Cedar Rapids. So it's very instructive to us. We know we're going to send Joni to Cedar Rapids, not a surrogate, not somebody else. She needs to go there. And you can see the numbers move. So internally, we use them very much, sometimes for tactics like that, but really for overall strategy, for what is our message going to be, where is it important, when do we need to do positive instead of negative ads. So very different. And I think it speaks to, we don't follow the horse race that closely. That's why I would encourage you not to either. We're really looking at that for strategic direction. Yes, it's always nice to know, and it's fun to tell the candidate, but that's really not the point of our polling.
Can I ask a question? Yeah. Because I don't do campaign polling, I do more issue-based polling. So has there ever been a time when a candidate has seen a public poll, horse race poll for either of you, and they freak out, and it's way different from your internal polling? Any good examples? YouGov? Oh, interesting.
So I don't know if you guys follow this. First of all, Morning Consult, YouGov, please be extremely cautious when you look at that data. If somebody gives you a ton of data as a reporter for free, there's a reason. But YouGov comes out twice a year. They aggregate all their polls from the previous 12 months to do a job approval for every sitting member of Congress, or every sitting senator. And obviously my sweet spot is the Senate. All of a sudden, I get 25 calls. Why does my data look like this from YouGov when it looks like this from you? So yes, that happens all the time. It's incredibly annoying, but most, at least sitting incumbents, get polling 101, so you can say, I'm sorry, Senator, they are averaging or aggregating your data from the last, 7 months. So that's not an accurate reflection of where you are right now, particularly in a state like Wyoming. They're still probably looking at 17 interviews.
And do you? I was struck yesterday. President Biden had a press conference, and he was asked a question. He's done this a couple of times, where it's very clear. He goes into deep detail on his numbers. I'm 56%, approval for this, and 48 to 40. He's clearly looking very carefully at his own numbers. And I wonder, for you guys who've worked on campaigns, the challenges of that sometimes, if a candidate, like how much they're governed or how in tune with the polling they are, and if that becomes a positive or a negative, I don't know.
Yeah, I think generally it's a negative because you want them out. In the case of the president, I think that's a very different dynamic because he's from the bully pulpit trying to build up the sense of momentum around the agenda, and I think that's different, sharing that. But in general, a candidate who is hyper-focused and obsessed on the numbers for every reason that you mentioned can just be counterproductive, because a lot of times it means the team is now sent off having to produce different numbers to actually show why. And a lot of times it's also just different weighting schemes. Like, well, we're looking at this because we think this is what turnout is going to look like. This poll is based on a different turnout scheme, and you'll go on a very long circuitous route just to prove something that actually the two polls are technically the same. They're just showing two divergent paths. So it's generally not helpful.
I would say I've had two different experiences with that, if I can. Are you doing on time? Yeah. So candidates never miss their polling calls. That is one call they will make no matter what. And most of my clients are sitting members of the U.S. Senate, so they have important jobs. They love their polling calls, and they usually come with a whole bevy of questions. So you need to be ready for that. But usually, if you were thoughtful and you're explaining to them what's going on, the dynamics are pretty easy to explain. There's one exception, and you mentioned, so George W. Bush hated polls. Never, I don't think he ever once looked at one of my polling briefings. He would say, I don't listen to pollings, I don't listen to focus groups. Rove certainly would, but President Bush did not believe that, and he did not follow his numbers. Outside of that, every single candidate I've ever had, they show up for their polling calls, they have a lot of questions. Every once in a while, they'll say something that you have to kind of take a moment and think through, like, this data can't be right. When I go to my rallies, you're like, well, back to the sample question. So absolutely.
One of the things that I think is interesting about polling is sort of the ways in which a question is asked can be an important yielder in getting a particular response. And one of the issues at the center of the political debate right now is abortion. And Tresa, I know you've done a lot of work, and you had a lengthy Twitter thread on this last year spelling out public opinion. And the 21st and last tweet in the thread, you wrote, "No single question captures opinion on this issue," with an exclamation point. So I wonder if you can expand a little bit on that and how we should look at polling on complex issues, how we should look at wording of questions in those issues, and how that affects public opinion on those things.
Yeah, I think on any policy issue, and not just abortion, there is no one question that explains public opinion or gives you a sense. And the unfortunate thing is the data that's available to you all as reporters is so narrow, and it's published by just a handful of pollsters. I mean, Washington Post, CNN, New York Times, Fox News. We're talking like 10 people in the whole country produce most of the polling that you have access to, and it's really a centimeter deep. One example, actually, it's not abortion, but it's crime. Leading up to the midterm elections, a question you might have access to because pollsters are asking it this way. Again, to my first point about through a political lens, who would do a better job on crime, Republicans or Democrats? Well, you're going to see Republicans, by whatever, 6 points. Well, we did a post-election assessment of the crime narrative in the midterms. We need to talk, because I'm curious what you all saw. But listen, I asked a really in-depth survey, 100 questions on the topic of crime, and how many ads did you see, and what's your position on policies, and et cetera. I did find that, Republicans had a 6-point advantage in that who do you trust more. Out of 100 questions, that was the only question Republicans had an advantage. For example, we had like 15 different policy solutions, ideas to, reduce crime. Guess what was number 15 out of 15? Tougher sentencing. Tough on crime policies. Here's what Republicans are saying. Here's what Democrats are saying. Which do you agree with more? Democrats by like 12 points. Even on support for the police accountability, talking about support and accountability, people want to hear more about that than just, throwing money at police. So that's the problem. If you only pay attention to that one poll that comes out from CNN or Fox or whoever says Republicans have the advantage, you're going to miss it. You're going to not have a complete understanding of what's going on. And as we saw in the election, it probably mattered in Wisconsin in that race. But, we saw in the exit polls that crime was, way down. And even in our swing state, post-election poll, even among Republicans, it was like number 8 issue.
Crime was huge. It started in 2020 with the summer protest, but what we found is it wasn't crime. I'm worried about my neighborhood. I'm worried about carjacking. It was sort of everything you saw happen during the pandemic. It was, I'm seeing more tent cities. I'm seeing more homelessness. So that, in the voters' mind, became crime, and that's what really we exploited in that Wisconsin race.
We're going to turn to questions here shortly. The microphones are up, so feel free to start lining up. And as people do, I in the last session, Ben Ginsburg had a comment saying credibility of the system is what keeps me up at night. Talking about the electoral and voting, I wonder for you guys as pollsters, credibility right now seems to be there's sort of a reckoning with the past couple of election cycles, and I wonder as you guys think about credibility in polling, how do you guys approach that question? What needs to be done to ensure the credibility of polls, and is that important? To have credibility in the polls.
I was going to say, don't believe the polls. That's fine. In terms of credibility, it goes back to all the transparency that we talked about. I think that's the most important thing, is demanding transparency and ignoring the polls where there isn't the transparency. I think beyond that, from a credibility perspective, to the extent that you are relying on the poll to tell you what is happening, so you can then go and explain to voters how it's happening, I wouldn't use the poll for that. From a credibility perspective, I wouldn't.
And I think it's key, and I think it's key to our industry and us as pollsters right now, and there's 2 things that need to happen. So I think 2022 and 2020 really taught us we were getting this right. Internal polls on campaigns and probably on issue management campaigns, they were correct. We did not see, 2022 you had a very large, someone with a very large bullhorn making claims about what was going to happen in the election that wasn't even possible. Knock on wood, we're never going to swing 50 seats. There just aren't that many competitive districts anymore. But you had that, and then you had all of those bad polls released at the same time. I think so it's up to all of us in this room, including us on the stage. We need to be better at policing that. We know those polls are wrong. We're seeing our own data. We need to help you understand why they're wrong. That's why we're glad to be up here to tell you this is what you look for in polls, and need to crack down on those people that are releasing that data. And then you, as journalists, we're looking for you to say, hey, I'm not going to report this, all of a sudden, Republicans are going to win the Pennsylvania Senate race by 5 points or something. So we all need to be better at that. And back to my original comment, if you want to report on the horse race, don't. Just go talk to voters.
And if I can just add very quickly, just the interpretive bias, that was the biggest problem in 2022, was I think all of us collectively, the political professionals and the reporters, assuming that the error that we saw in 2016 and 2018, where the polls had a pro-democratic bias, that would happen again. And in the end, I think the coverage showed that, right? Everyone said, well, yeah, the polls actually look pretty good for Democrats, but the polls, let's bake in a 3 or 4 point Democratic bias. Actually, Republicans are and I think the coverage showed that. We can't obviously we need to learn from that because most polls actually had a pro-Republican bias to the extent that they did have a bias this time.
Especially that plethora in the last 2 weeks of crappy polls. If you haven't heard of the organization, it's probably not a good poll.
All right, we have a good line on both sides. Let's go over here first. Yeah, if you could state your name and organization, we'd appreciate it.
Rob Gianiny with the Missoulian.
Born and raised?
Yes, indeed. So what's going on in your R&D department? What are you guys doing for the polls for the next cycle and the cycle beyond that you're going to either steal from the marketing folks or from the deep dive data AI folks? What are you looking at to rebuild your crystal ball?
Well, I'd love to touch on that. Our polling team at TargetSmart at our core, we're a data company, we're a big data company, so that certainly speaks to us. Multi-mode data collection is where it's at, which means collecting data from people as many different ways as possible. Obviously, we know about online surveys, text to web surveys where you're texting someone a link. Some people are now using postcard QR codes, right? Because every mode of communication has a bias in it in terms of who's going to respond. So trying to get different people, trying to stay ahead of the curve before people catch up and everyone herds and does the same thing. So when someone gets a card in the mailbox as a QR code, they scan it and it launches them to a survey. It's novel. It'll work for a couple cycles and then you need to find the next thing. We're using more online panels, online message boards for focus group replacements where you're actually having people in a more relaxed environment be able to communicate and you're monitoring that and prompting. So it's really is any way you can think of communicating with voters and collecting information, we're trying it.
That's absolutely right. We have to meet the voters where they are. So that's what was the big miss in 2016. Everybody missed the Trump voters. I like to say he didn't even need to have an R next to his name. He should have a T next to his name because he was the Twitter candidate. But you have to find the voters where they are. Trump's voters where they're online, or there's rural households that still have landlines. So that's absolutely right.
All right, let's go over here.
Hi, Jacob Rubashkin from Inside Elections. In 2020, we saw, not just at the presidential and the Senate, but really on the congressional district level, some high-profile misses. You know, we saw party committees spending so much money in uncompetitive races, like French Hill's district got millions of dollars, but Lauren Underwood's got none, even though she only won by 2 points and he won by 10. We saw less of that in 2022. Is there a reason why you think that things kind of rebounded within the accuracy of the polling that, you know, that you do, not necessarily that the teenagers at Exeter do? And is it something about Trump being on the ballot versus off, or a change in practice over the last couple years?
Well, so there definitely is a factor when Trump's on the ballot. We've all learned that and learned how to sort of accommodate for that as best we can. As for those House races, I think 2022, the polls were pretty consistently right. 2020, the Senate polls were right. We did have problems on the House. And really what happened in that election is things changed so late in those House races. Those House races were national races for so long. And then right at the very end, they started to break, especially like Hill's district, on more local issues. I don't think that was a polling miss as much as it was a timing miss. It's kind of talking about like the Scott Brown race and tracking. I think they missed the timing of voters. That's what I saw.
All right, let's go over here.
Hi, Josh Kane with the San Francisco Standard. I guess my question's a little bit more philosophical, but you mentioned that you saw that people were upset about homelessness, and that was something that could be hit on through a candidate's platform. But you mentioned that actually the carryover was to focus on crime, which are two different things. And I was curious what your take is on how polling can drive a narrative like that crime is up when over decades crime has actually gone down. And in San Francisco, people say crime is the biggest issue of the city, but actually our murder rate is very, very low. Crime is actually as low as it's been since like 1990. And so I'm curious what kind of responsibility pollsters have in advising candidates to use issues like crime to get votes, and what that does to us as a society when we focus on crime when it's not really as bad as maybe the candidates are saying in public to voters?
No, you just absolutely made my point. So crime is not up everywhere, but voters see it up because they're seeing more homelessness. They're seeing more tent cities, and in their mind, that's crime. So they're making that link, and they're telling us. So our job is not to drive the narrative. Our job is to see where voters are at and talk about those issues. So if you take it from like a candidate side, if you're tough on crime, or maybe you're for eliminating cash bail, whatever your position on crime is, we know we need to be talking about crime. But we're not driving. The voters are telling us, this is my number one issue. This is what I want my legislators focused on. So they drive what we talk about. You see this all the time. Like, I have candidates like, I have the best water policy. I save Lake Michigan. Nobody cares. So it's really the voters telling us what in the candidate's record we need to talk about. And that link that made between homelessness and crime, voters made that. We found that out in focus groups. We would say, okay, crime is up. What are you seeing? Are you worried about walking to your car at night? And it was like, no, look around. If you go to Main Street, we have all these new tent cities. So it's really the voters informing us.
Oh, go ahead, Tresa. I was actually going to refer to research that you've done because I mentioned before the notion of let's not use the polls to tell us what's happening, because I think to your point, if the polls tell us, crime is a problem, then as reporters we think, okay, the poll's saying that voters think it's a problem, let's write about it. And I think a great example, and again, I think you were very effective on Tresa, was leading up to the election, polls were saying that abortion had faded as an issue. And that's a lot of what your thread talked about, was the notion that a lot of it was just the way you were polling it. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. I don't know if that's what you were going to add on.
Well, I was going to actually just go back to, because I can't speak to the Republican consultants, but I do have experience with some of the Democratic consultants on crime in the midterms who, this is my own perception, is some Democratic consultants are really driven by fear, and they don't want their candidate to lose, right? And they're also older, maybe 60 or older, so they're more wedded to conventional wisdom, and they're less likely to be challenged by, different thinking. And so when they think, when suddenly Republicans are pouring millions into crime ads, they think, and they're thinking, oh, defunding the police, whatever, we have to like throw money, let's put 100,000 more police on the ground, whatever. So they'll start using a Republican message around and start driving the narrative around that. And then as a result of the consultants saying, you got to back police, you got to have this, you got to increase funding for police, blah, blah, blah. By the way, voters aren't even there if you explore and ask the questions in a more in-depth way. Then suddenly you get this candidate who maybe wins. Do you think that candidate, once they're in office, is going to work on, criminal justice reform? No. Do you know? So I think consultants actually do play a role in, what's the narrative is, what's going to happen, and, eventually it affects policy.
We've got a little less than 2 minutes, so we'll have one last quick question and
Okay. I'm Dan Vakken with Route 50. Just following up on that, I'm very interested in how reporters break the link between, you have more data that says when they say crime, they mean homelessness. And you were talking about how all the public data is an inch deep or a centimeter deep. How do reporters avoid, I think a lot of reporters follow the campaign narratives, assuming they have good data. There was a candidate in Illinois who ran for governor who said, crime was going to be a big deal, and he lost the primary. So how do reporters get smarter and not follow kind of the lead that polling is taking them, because we don't see the depth of it?
I think you got to look at polling that is not covered through, this game lens. Who's winning, who's losing? It's not covered through, do Republicans do better at this? Will Democrats do better at this? And you're looking more at, and this is the work we do, just more on issues and polling that covers issues. So Pew's pretty good at that. asking several questions about a specific issue. The problem is in our industry, both of our industries, there's very little in-depth polling available, publicly available. I mean, it's just very little. And the reason behind that is money. It costs a lot of money. And who's going to fund it? So it's a problem. But I would say my advice would be to reach out to issue experts. So who really studies opinions on specific issues, not the campaigns, not necessarily political pollsters necessarily. I don't know. You all might disagree.
The only thing
Yeah, our time has ended,
I'll
unfortunately.
meet you after.
But yeah, we'll be outside, and I wanted to thank Tom and Brenda and Tresa for a great conversation, and thank you all for coming. It's been enjoyable. Thank you.
Thank you.